Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Oh,
Today we're going to be looking into something I think a lot of us have thought about, especially over the last few years,
yeah, for sure.
and that is the reclusive lifestyle.
Definitely.
Now, of course, there's this romantic idea of like the solitary genius or the hermit who's, found peace away from it all.
Right, like Thoreau.
Exactly. But we're going to try to go a little deeper than that, and look at both the benefits and the costs of actually shutting yourself off from the world.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is we have a really unique perspective for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Our source material comes from a guy named Andrew A.J. Johnson,
Okay.
who's been living as a recluse since 2020.
Wow. So right in the thick of things when he.
Yeah, right when everyone else was forced to isolate, he actually chose it.
Oh, that's so
And he's
interesting.
made this YouTube video about his experience that's just brutally honest,
Wow.
almost like a confession. And really doesn't hold back on the downsides.
That's what I'm interested in.
Me too.
Because it's easy to romanticize, that solitary life, but I think there's a lot more to it.
Oh, absolutely. There's some pretty dark sides that he talks about.
I remember one thing he said that really stuck with me. He said, there were times I felt like I was almost dying in a spiritual or emotional sense.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff.
So how does someone even get to that point?
Yeah.
What's the allure of shutting yourself off from the world in the first place?
Well, I think Andrew actually makes a really good point about that. He talks about freedom as a major draw.
Freedom.
Yeah, freedom from social pressures, expectations,
Right.
the constant hustle of modern life.
Always being on.
Exactly. It's about controlling your environment, your time, your finances, even down to leaving those dishes in the sink overnight if you want.
No judgment from roommates. No passive-aggressive notes from family.
Right.
That does sound kind of tempting sometimes, I have to admit.
Yeah.
But didn't he also say something about becoming almost addicted to that solitude?
He did.
That's where it starts to feel less like freedom and more like a trap, right?
Absolutely. And that's where I think the psychological complexities really come in. You mentioned that idea of addiction to solitude.
Yeah.
I'm curious what struck you about that.
Yeah.
Is that a common pitfall, do you think, for people seeking a more solitary life?
Well, it makes me think about how any behavior, even something generally considered positive, like spending time alone, can become unhealthy if it's taken to an extreme.
Right.
And I think Andrew's story really highlights that slippery slope. He describes struggling to socialize after years of reclusion, even in situations he wanted to enjoy.
Wow.
It's like he lost the ability to connect.
That's a really crucial point and something we need to explore further, I think. As humans, we are wired for connection. It's a fundamental need, not just a social nicety.
Right.
And prolonged isolation can actually impact the brain in ways that make it harder to engage with others.
That makes sense.
Think about it. How do we learn, grow, and even regulate our emotions? A huge part of that comes from interacting with other people.
It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron.
Exactly.
Without that friction, we might get a little dull.
Right. And speaking of dull, I'm curious about something Andrew said regarding the practical challenges of a reclusive lifestyle.
Okay.
He mentioned how the world isn't really designed for single people and how that can lead to some financial difficulties.
Yeah, I remember that. He talked about how things are often packaged in bulk. Great for families, but not so practical if you're cooking for one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, are there systemic factors that contribute to the difficulty of living a solitary life? Or is it more about individual choices and resources?
It's probably a bit of both, right?
Probably.
But, even with all the potential downsides, the idea of a reclusive lifestyle still holds a certain allure for a lot of people.
It does.
Why do you think that is? What is it about solitude that continues to draw us in, even in the face of warnings like Andrew's?
I think it speaks to a deep-seated yearning for peace, for space to simply be away from the demands and judgments of the outside world.
Especially in our hyper-connected, always-on society.
Exactly.
That desire for disconnection can feel incredibly strong.
For sure.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes I fantasize about just disappearing off the grid for a while.
Yeah.
Cabin in the woods, no Wi-Fi, just me and a stack of books.
Oh, yeah.
But then I remember how much I actually enjoy going out with friends, having deep conversations, laughing until my sides hurt.
Right.
So maybe it's about finding that balance, right?
I think so.
Embracing moments of solitude without letting them completely overtake your life.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that both connection and solitude are essential for our well-being.
Okay.
And I think Andrew's story, while cautionary, actually provides some valuable insights into how to achieve that balance.
All right. I'm ready to dive deeper into that. What are some of the specific things we can learn from his experience, both about the benefits and the potential pitfalls of seeking solitude?
Well, one of the most striking things about Andrew's story is his honesty about the emotional toll of prolonged isolation.
Right. He described loneliness as a sinkhole,
Yeah.
a feeling that almost consumed him.
It's true, and he even said, it felt like I was dying, which I think really gets to the heart of how debilitating that kind of loneliness can be.
Yeah, that sent chills down my spine when I heard him say that. As someone who enjoys my alone time, it makes me wonder, where's the line between healthy solitude and the kind of isolation that starts to chip away at your well-being?
That's a question a lot of people grapple with, and there's no easy answer because it's so individual.
Yeah.
But I think what we can learn from Andrew's experience is that it's crucial to be aware of the potential for loneliness to become a real problem.
Okay.
It's not just about feeling sad or missing your friends. Chronic loneliness can have serious impacts on both mental and physical health.
So how do we recognize those warning signs? What are some red flags that maybe a relationship with solitude is tipping into something unhealthy?
One key indicator is how you feel when you're around other people. Andrew mentioned struggling to socialize, even when he wanted to. If you find yourself feeling drained or anxious in social situations, or if you actively avoid them altogether, that could be a sign that you're becoming too isolated.
He also talked about overthinking and getting stuck in negative thought patterns.
Right.
It's like the lack of outside input creates this echo chamber where those thoughts can just spiral out of control.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Our brains need stimulation, different perspectives, challenges to our own assumptions. Without that, it's easy to fall into a kind of mental rut. And when you're already feeling isolated, those negative thought patterns can become even more entrenched.
So in a way, maintaining those connections with other people is almost like a form of mental hygiene.
I love that analogy.
It helps keep things fresh,
Yeah.
prevents us from getting too stuck in our own heads.
Absolutely. And it's not just about deep conversations or spending hours with people. Even small interactions, chatting with a barista, saying hello to a neighbor, can have a positive impact on our mood and well-being.
I've definitely noticed that sometimes just a quick friendly exchange with a stranger can totally shift my energy. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about another aspect of Andrew's experience that I found really interesting, the societal perceptions of recluses. He mentioned feeling judged, even stereotyped.
He actually used the phrase playing into those perceptions, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, why do you think he did that?
It makes me think about how we often feel pressure to conform, even when it comes to something as personal as how much time we spend alone.
Right, like there's this unspoken expectation that we should be outgoing social butterflies constantly connected.
Exactly. And anyone who deviates too far from that norm can be viewed with suspicion or even fear. We tend to label people who are different, and those labels can become self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yeah, if everyone expects you to be a certain way, you might start to act that way, even if it doesn't reflect who you truly are.
Right.
It's like he was conforming to the caricature of a recluse, which is both sad and a little bit humorous. But it also highlights how powerful those societal expectations can be, even when we try to resist them.
And it's important to remember that those expectations can vary depending on our cultural background, age, and even our gender. In some cultures, solitude is valued as a time for reflection and spiritual growth, while in others, it's seen as a sign of social awkwardness or even mental instability.
That's a good point.
Huh.
That makes me think about Andrew's comment about how his experience might resonate with millennials.
Yeah.
He talked about the pressure to achieve the instability, the disillusionment that many in his generation feel.
Yeah, he described it as a transitory, strange time.
Which I think perfectly captures the feeling of uncertainty and flux that many of us are experiencing right now.
Definitely.
So given that context, is it any wonder that some people are seeking refuge in solitude? It's like they're opting out of a system that feels broken, trying to find a sense of peace and control in a world that feels increasingly chaotic.
But as Andrew's story shows, even opting out has its own set of challenges. It's not a simple solution, and it's certainly not a path without its own potential pitfalls.
This leads us to a crucial question for our listeners.
Yes, let's turn the focus outward. We've explored Andrew's experiences in depth. Now it's time to connect this back to you.
Okay, I'm ready to pose the question. If Andrew's journey highlights both the allure and the dangers of seeking solitude, what are your own personal aspirations and concerns when it comes to finding balance between connection and alone time?
That's an important point for reflection. We all have different needs, different thresholds for how much solitude feels good and when it starts to tip into isolation. It's about figuring out what works for you personally.
Right, because what might feel isolating to one person could be perfectly comfortable for another.
Exactly. And that's where I think Andrew's story can be really instructive. Even though his experience was ultimately negative,
Right.
he doesn't completely dismiss the value of solitude.
Yeah, I remember him talking about how it allowed him space for self-care and spiritual practice, things that are often hard to prioritize in the hustle of daily life.
Absolutely. And the key takeaway there is that he found those practices beneficial. It's not solitude itself that's the problem,
Right.
but rather the potential for it to become all-consuming.
Yeah, he even talks about how solitude helped him cope with the chaos and uncertainty of recent
Oh,
years.
for sure.
It was like a way to protect himself, to find a moment of peace amidst the storm.
I can see that.
But then he also describes how that same protective bubble eventually turned into a prison.
Right, and that's where the idea of balance becomes so crucial. It's about recognizing that both connection and solitude have their place in our lives and finding a way to integrate them in a way that feels healthy and sustainable.
So how do we do that? How do we find that sweet spot?
I think it starts with being honest with ourselves about our needs and limits.
Okay.
Are you someone who thrives on social interaction? Or do you need more time alone to recharge?
Right, right.
What are the activities that nourish you both socially and individually?
And maybe it's not even about finding a fixed ratio or schedule, but rather about being attuned to how we're feeling in the moment.
Yeah.
If you're starting to feel drained or isolated, maybe it's time to reach out to a friend or engage in a social activity.
Exactly.
On the flip side, if you're feeling overwhelmed and overstimulated, it might be time to step back and create some space for yourself.
That's a great point. It's about being mindful and intentional about how we structure our lives, making sure there's room for both connection and solitude.
And it's about being aware of the stories we tell ourselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Andrew talked about getting stuck in these loops of negative thinking, reinforcing his belief that people were untrustworthy or that he was somehow damaged. How can we challenge those negative thought patterns and cultivate a more positive outlook?
One powerful tool is gratitude.
Gratitude.
Focusing on the things we're grateful for, both in our relationships and in our solitary moments, can shift our perspective and help us appreciate the good in our lives.
I love that. It's so easy to get caught up in what's lacking. But when we deliberately focus on what we have, it can make a world of difference.
Another helpful strategy is to challenge those negative thoughts directly.
Okay.
Ask yourself, is this thought really true? What evidence do I have to support it? Often when we examine those negative beliefs more closely, we realize they're not based on reality.
It's like those thought distortions that cognitive behavioral therapy talks about.
Right.
All or nothing thinking, catastrophizing mind reading.
Yeah.
Once you start to recognize those patterns, you can start to reframe those thoughts in a more balanced and realistic way.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of simply getting out in nature.
Nature.
Studies have shown that spending time in green spaces can reduce stress, improve mood, and even boost our immune systems.
You know, for me, a walk in the woods is like hitting the reset button.
I hear you.
It helps me clear my head and connect with something bigger than myself and come back to my life feeling refreshed and grounded.
And if you're feeling really stuck, don't hesitate to reach out for professional support. A therapist can provide a safe and supportive space to explore those negative thought patterns and develop strategies for cultivating a more balanced relationship with solitude and connection.
That's such an important reminder. There's no shame in asking for help, and sometimes it's exactly what we need to get back on track.
Andrew's story, while cautionary, ultimately offers a message of hope. Even though he struggled, he was willing to share his experience, both the good and the bad, in order to help others.
And I think that's the most valuable takeaway from all of this. We're all on a journey, and sometimes we stumble, sometimes we get lost. But by being open and honest about our struggles, by learning from each other's experiences, we can find our way back to a place of balance and well-being.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the complexities of a reclusive lifestyle, we encourage you to continue reflecting on your own relationship with solitude and connection.
What aspects of Andrew's journey resonate with you? What are your personal aspirations and concerns? And most importantly, what steps can you take to create a life that honors your unique needs for both connection and alone time?
Remember, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's about finding what works for you, being mindful of the potential pitfalls, and always striving for balance. And as Andrew reminds us, even amidst the challenges, there's still room for curiosity, for wonder, and for the simple joy of being alive. It's really about finding that balance, isn't it?
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because Even though Andrew's experience with a reclusive lifestyle ultimately went south, he doesn't completely write off solitude.
Right.
He actually talks about how those periods of being alone gave him space for self-care and spiritual practice,
That's interesting.
which I think is something a lot of us struggle with in our busy lives.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to let those things fall by the wayside when you're constantly bombarded with demands and distractions.
So in a way, solitude can be a tool for those things, right?
I think so.
Mm.
It can provide the space and quiet we need to connect with ourselves and cultivate those practices that bring us peace and well-being.
But the key is not letting it go too far.
It's exactly. Like anything else, it's about moderation. Finding that sweet spot where solitude enhances your life rather than consuming it.
So how do we do that? How do we prevent those periods of solitude from turning into, the kind of isolation that Andrew experienced?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is being intentional about how we use that time alone.
Okay.
It's not just about physically being away from people, but about creating a mental and emotional space that's conducive to reflection and growth.
You mean like being mindful of what we're consuming?
Exactly.
Mhm.
Are we filling that time with activities that nourish us, or are we just numbing ourselves with distractions?
It's like, are we using solitude to connect with ourselves or escape from ourselves?
Right. And that can be a tough question to answer honestly,
Right.
but I think it's an important one to consider.
Absolutely. So aside from being intentional with our time, what else can we do to strike that balance?
One other thing that Andrew touched on that I think is really important is the power of community.
Okay.
Even if you cherish your time alone, having a supportive network of people you can connect with is crucial.
So it's not an either-or situation.
Right. It's not about choosing between connection and solitude, but about recognizing the value of both.
And finding ways to weave them together in a way that works for you.
Exactly. Because ultimately, both connection and solitude contribute to a richer, more fulfilling life.
Well said. And I think that's a great note to end on. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I encourage you to reflect on your own relationship with solitude and connection. What aspects of Andrew's story resonate with you? And what steps can you take to create a life that honors your unique needs for both?
Remember, it's about finding that balance and creating a life that feels authentic and fulfilling for you.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of the recluse. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
We'll see you then.